Imagine a protest. Millions of citizens marching on the streets of a supposedly free republic, holding signs that say only 3 words: nitrogen monoxide kings. But this is not a routine argument over policy or a mere political disagreement. It is a fundamental confrontation between the will of the people and the silent, overwhelming power of the state. Because as the marchers filled the squares of America, from the massive crowds in New York to the smaller assemblies in state capitals, the immediate, systemic response from the governing elite was not a press conference. It was a military deployment. From Texas to Virginia, Republican governors signed orders that sent a clear, chilling message across the entire nation: the National Guard is on standby. This is not a simple contingency plan. This is not a preparation for a hurricane, a flood, or a foreign invasion. This is the activation of a state-level military force trained for combat and disaster, now turned inward against American civilians. The question is, why? Because the protests were immediately and repeatedly dismissed by Republican leaders as Antifa-linked, radicals, hate America rallies, and a direct, violent threat to civil order. The rhetoric is, in itself, a weapon. The moment you frame a constitutional right, the right to peaceably assemble, as a prelude to insurrection, you justify the military response. But the true, insidious power of the deployment is not in the soldiers who may or may not reach the street. It is in the threat of their existence. The mere sight of armed, uniformed troops near a civilian demonstration is an act of calculated psychological warfare. It asks the American citizen a terrifying question: how far are you willing to go to defend your constitutional rights when the state is prepared to meet you with armed force? It transforms an act of protected political speech into a calculated, high-risk military maneuver for every citizen involved. The weight of this action is rooted in the founding principles of the nation. The core of the American Republic was built on the fear of a standing army enforcing civilian law. This fear was codified into the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, the legal firewall that strictly forbids the federal military from acting as domestic police. But the National Guard is the ultimate loophole, a dual status force that exists in 2 worlds. When the Guard is placed on standby by a governor, they are operating under Title 30 status. They are controlled by the state, and crucially, they are not restricted by the Posse Comitatus Act. This allows them to step into law enforcement roles, making arrests, establishing barricades, and enforcing curfews. This is the state's iron fist. Conversely, if the president were to federalize the Guard, they shift to Title 10 status, become identical to active duty troops, and the Posse Comitatus firewall is reestablished, limiting their police functions. The governors who activated their Guard under state control are preemptively asserting an extraordinary threat, declaring that local police forces are insufficient. In essence, they are making a political declaration under the cover of military readiness. This escalation immediately raises the specter of the Insurrection Act of 1807. This is the ultimate, nuclear option of executive power. The only mechanism that allows a president to unilaterally dissolve that constitutional firewall and bring the full weight of the federal military to bear on the American street, even against the will of a state's governor. The Insurrection Act is not intended for political maneuvering. Its history is a dark ledger of America's most profound domestic crises, from George Washington's march to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, to Lincoln's use of it to hold the Union together during the Civil War, to Eisenhower's deployment of paratroopers to Little Rock to enforce civil rights against a hostile state government, and finally to George H.W. Bush's response to the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. Each instance was a tacit admission that the civilian order had collapsed. The No Kings protests, while highly political, were not a collapse of order. They were a peaceful, if massive, exercise in political dissent. The governors who used the threat of the Guard were, therefore, making a dangerous, preemptive move. They were applying the language of insurrection and rebellion to the democratic right to protest, moving the state's response from a last resort measure to a first response deterrent. This is fundamentally changing the nature of American freedom. when the executive branch moves to establish a permanent, rapid deployment National Guard Quick Reaction Force QRF, a unit specifically trained to quell civil disturbances across the entire nation. It signals a dangerous step toward the institutionalization of domestic military deployment. This action codifies the very fear the founders held that the military is becoming a ready-to-deploy internal political tool, risking the long-standing trust Americans have placed in their armed forces. The protesters marched against the spirit of a king. The response was the calculated display of the king's ultimate authority, the ability to bring the armed forces to bear against his own people. The U.S. Constitution guarantees a republic, not a monarchy. But as the world watches, the ultimate question is no longer about the words on the documents. It is about the force that guards the system. And when the governors deploy the guard against the people who declare no kings, they show the true, unyielding power of the state. They show that in the guarded republic, the ultimate, final power is always the one with the uniform.